I found out he had sold my phone on a Tuesday afternoon in October when I reached into my purse for it and my hand closed around nothing. I stood in the parking lot of the Kroger on Peachtree Industrial Boulevard in Duluth, Georgia, bags of groceries at my feet, and I just held my empty hand open and stared at it like it might offer some kind of explanation. I had left the house at 2 in the afternoon. I had my phone then. I was certain of it. I set the bags down on the asphalt and went through every compartment of my purse twice. Nothing. I drove home with a feeling in my chest that I didn't have a word for yet. Something between confusion and a very cold, very quiet kind of knowing. Marcus was in the kitchen when I got back. 34 years old, 6'1", the kind of man who walked into rooms like he expected applause. He was leaning against the counter eating an apple, still in his work clothes, and he didn't look up when I came in. I set the grocery bags on the table and I said, "Marcus, have you seen my phone?" And he took another bite of the apple and said, "Yeah, I sold it." Just like that. I sold it. No introduction, no preface, no pretending it was a conversation. Just a statement of fact delivered to the ceiling. I was 27 years old. I had been married to this man for 3 years, and I had given up a job offer in Charlotte, North Carolina, to follow him to Atlanta when his company transferred him. I was standing in a kitchen I had decorated myself, in a house we had bought together with a down payment that included $40,000 from my savings, and I was being told that my phone had been sold. My phone, that I had paid for, that was registered in my name. I said, "You sold my phone," not a question. He finally looked at me. "You spend too much time talking to your family," he said. His voice was completely level, the way people talk when they've already decided they're right, and the conversation is just a formality. I just stared at him. He took another bite of the apple. "I needed the money," he said. "I'll get you another one when I have time." I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I pulled out one of the kitchen chairs, sat down, and looked at my husband. Really looked at him. And I thought, this is not the first time. This is just the first time he did it to something I could hold in my hand. My name is Claire Renee Whitfield. I was born and raised in Savannah, Georgia, the second of 3 daughters. And I grew up in a house where my mother called us every Sunday no matter where we were, and my grandmother kept the phone cord stretched all the way to the back porch so she could talk and hang laundry at the same time. Communication was not just a habit in my family, it was love made audible. My mother, Patricia, was the person I called when I got into the master's program at Georgia State. She was the person I called when I got my first real job, doing content strategy for a mid-sized healthcare marketing firm in Midtown Atlanta. She was the first person I told when Marcus proposed at a rooftop restaurant on Peachtree Street, and she cried so hard she had to hand the phone to my sister Denise. Marcus had known this about me from the beginning. He had come to Sunday dinners at my mother's house in Savannah. He had sat at that table and laughed at my grandmother's stories and eaten my mother's baked chicken and said the words, "Your family is incredible." He had said those words. I heard him say them. But somewhere between the proposal and the wedding and the move to Atlanta and the first year of marriage, something shifted in him. Or maybe it didn't shift. Maybe the version of Marcus who sat at my mother's table was always a performance, and the version standing in this kitchen with an apple was the real one. I genuinely do not know. What I do know is that by the time he sold my phone, he had already spent 18 months telling me in 100 different ways that my family was a problem. It started with small things. He didn't want me making personal calls from the living room when he was watching television, so I started going into the bedroom. Then the bedroom was too close to the living room, so I started going out to the car. Then it was, "You always look tired after you talk to your mother, like she drains you," said with a concerned expression, the kind of concern that's actually a small blade. Then it was, "I feel like your mother is more involved in our marriage than she should be," said after I mentioned that my mom had asked how things were going. How things were going. A normal question, a Sunday afternoon question from a mother to her daughter. I noticed it. Of course I noticed it. I'm not a fool, and I was never passive. But I also loved him, and loving someone in a marriage has a way of making you apply very generous interpretations to things that don't deserve generosity. I told myself he was stressed about work. I told myself he had grown up in a different kind of family. Marcus's parents had divorced when he was 11, and his mother, Beverly, had raised him largely alone in Marietta, Georgia. and maybe that had made him protective of what he thought of as the boundaries of the marital unit. I told myself a lot of things. Beverly. That is where the second wound was located, and it was deeper than I initially understood. Beverly Hartwell, née Caldwell, was 61 years old and lived 20 minutes from our house in a beige ranch-style home with a perfectly maintained front lawn and a very particular sense of what a daughter-in-law was supposed to be. She had Marcus at 27, raised him through a difficult decade, and she held that sacrifice like a torch she expected everyone to acknowledge. She was not unkind in the conventional sense. She brought food when Marcus was sick. She remembered birthdays. She was pleasant at Sunday church. But she operated from a very clear set of beliefs about what a wife's role was, and those beliefs did not include maintaining close relationships with your own family of origin. The first time I heard her say something that truly alarmed me was about 8 months into the marriage, at a dinner at her house. I mentioned that I was going to Savannah the following weekend to see my mother, who had just had a minor knee procedure. Beverly set down her fork, looked at Marcus, and then looked at me, and said, "You know, Marcus's first priority is his home." She didn't say it to me like a warning. She said it to me like a correction, like I had made an arithmetic error and she was helping me find the right answer. Marcus said nothing. He kept eating. I looked at my mother-in-law across that table, and I smiled and I said, "And my first priority is my family. And since Marcus is part of my family, I figure we're aligned." She made a sound in the back of her throat that was not agreement. And Marcus told me on the drive home that I had been rude. There it was. I had been rude. Not Beverly, who had implied that visiting my recovering mother was an act of disloyalty to my husband. Me, because I had answered her. By the time Marcus sold my phone, Beverly had been working on him for the better part of 2 years, and I had slowly begun to understand that what I was dealing with was not simply a husband who was a little possessive. I was dealing with a man who had outsourced his worldview to his mother and called it leadership. Every limitation he placed on my life had been preceded, somewhere in the timeline, by a conversation with Beverly. I didn't know the contents of those conversations then. I would find out. But I could feel the shape of them in the way Marcus talked, in specific phrases that sounded more like his mother than like the man I had married. A married woman doesn't need her mother's opinion on every decision. Your family has their way of doing things, and we have ours. You call Savannah more than you call me at work. The phone. Right. I need you to understand what losing that phone meant beyond the obvious. Yes, it was a device I had paid $380 for when I bought it secondhand from a coworker. Yes, it was registered in my name. Yes, he had sold it without telling me, without asking me, without any process other than deciding he had the right to. But it was also my direct line to my mother, to my sister Denise, to my closest friend from college, Maya Torres, who lived in Nashville and texted me funny things at random hours. It was the thread that connected me to the life I had existed in before Marcus decided what my life should look like. And he knew that. He sold it because he knew that. I sat at that kitchen table for a long time after he finished the apple and walked out of the room. I sat there and I looked at the wall, and I did what I always do when something has gone so far past acceptable that my brain needs a moment to catch up to what my gut already knows. I got very, very still, and then I started thinking, I want to tell you what the house felt like that night, because the physical details matter. It was a split-level house in Duluth, 1,100 square feet, the kind of layout where sound travels and you can never quite feel alone in a room. Marcus was watching something on the television in the living room. I could hear the canned laugh track from the kitchen. The refrigerator hummed. Outside it was just past dark, and the neighbor's dog was barking at something across the fence. The kitchen smelled like the chicken I'd been planning to cook for dinner, which I now had no desire to make. I opened the refrigerator, looked at the groceries I had just bought, and closed it again. I did not cook dinner that night. I went to bed at 8:15, and I stared at the ceiling, and I thought about a very specific thing. Every single time in the past 18 months that Marcus had said or done something that felt wrong to me, and how many of those times I had traced it back to Beverly's orbit. I wasn't dramatic about it. I wasn't making a list in my head with flourishes. I was doing something much simpler and much colder. I was deciding how serious this actually was. By the time the light from the living room went dark and Marcus came to bed at 11, I had made a preliminary assessment. And the assessment was this: he didn't sell my phone because he was having a bad day. He didn't sell my phone because he needed money for an emergency. We had a joint savings account with over $9,000 in it at that moment. I had checked online just 3 weeks ago. He sold my phone because he wanted to, because he believed he could. Because somewhere between Beverly's kitchen table and this marriage, he had decided that controlling my access to my own family was not only acceptable, it was appropriate. I breathed next to him in the dark, and I thought, I need a phone, and I need to talk to my mother, and something is going to have to change. If you are wondering how a woman who had a master's degree and a career and a functioning brain ended up here, trust me, I have asked myself that question more times than I can count. The answer is not simple, and it's not flattering, and it's also not unique. Marcus had been charming in a very specific way. He made me feel safe before he made me feel monitored. He was attentive before he was controlling. He called it love for a very long time, and I believed him, because the early version of it felt like love. It felt like someone finally paying close attention to me. It took me a while to understand that attention and surveillance are not the same thing, and that a person can use the vocabulary of protection to build a cage so gradually that you don't notice the walls until you try to walk through one. I grew up watching my mother be strong. Patricia Whitfield was the kind of woman who raised 3 girls on a nurse's salary after my father's business failed, and she never once made us feel the weight of that. She taught Sunday school, grew tomatoes in the backyard, and called out nonsense when she saw it. Gently, always, but clearly. She had met Marcus twice before the wedding, and both times she had said, after he left the room, something she never quite finished saying out loud. She would start, "I just think," and then she would stop herself, and I was too in love to chase the sentence to its end. I wish I had chased it. My sister Denise, 29 and living in Savannah working as a pediatric nurse, had been more direct. She had said, approximately 4 months before the wedding, that Marcus had a way of making the room feel like it revolved around him that she found exhausting. I told her she had only met him a few times. She said, "Yeah, that's usually enough." I laughed it off. I was wrong to laugh it off. My friend Maya, who had known me since sophomore year at Georgia State, had never met a single version of Marcus she fully trusted. She didn't say why exactly. Maya expressed things obliquely in texts with a particular dry humor that meant she was serious. The first time she met him at a party, she texted me the next day. "Very handsome. Very sure of himself. You doing okay?" I told her I was wonderful. She sent back a thumbs up, and then, 3 seconds later, just, okay. I had all these people, these brilliant, loving, careful people who were paying attention on my behalf when I couldn't pay it on my own. And Marcus had spent 18 months finding ways to make their voices quieter. Now, he had literally removed the device through which those voices reached me. I want to be precise about what I did next, because this is the part that matters. 3 days after he sold my phone, I drove to a Target on my lunch break and bought a prepaid smartphone with cash, not because I was hiding it immediately, though I would end up doing that, but because I needed a phone. I had money in my own personal checking account, and I was not going to ask my husband's permission to communicate with my own mother. I drove back to the office, set the phone up in the parking garage, and called my mother from my car. Patricia Whitfield answered on the second ring the way she always did, with a bright hello that sounded like she'd been waiting for good news. When she heard my voice, she said, "Oh, thank God, baby, I have been calling your phone for 3 days. I said, "I know, Mama. Something happened with my phone. I'm using a different one." And my voice was steady because I had been practicing being steady. There was a pause on her end. Then she said, "What happened?" And I said, "I'll explain soon. I just wanted you to hear my voice." I heard her breathe. "Tell me where you are," she said. I told her I was in the parking garage at work in Atlanta, and I was fine, and I would call her that Sunday with more time to talk. And she said, "Claire," and I said, "Mama," and she said, "You call me the second anything doesn't feel right." I said, "Yes, ma'am," and she said, "I mean anything." The way she said it told me she had already finished the sentence she never finished before the wedding. She had already arrived at the conclusion she'd been keeping to herself. I sat in that parking garage for 4 more minutes after we hung up, And then I put the prepaid phone in the inner zipper compartment of my work bag, behind a folder of printed contracts, and I went back to my desk. I did not tell Marcus about the phone. I decided that evening that I was going to stop telling Marcus things until I understood what he was planning to do with them. This is where my story shifts, and I want you to feel the shift with me. Because what happened in the weeks that followed was not a dramatic explosion. It was quieter than that. It was me, in the margin spaces of my regular life, beginning to look at everything with different eyes. And what I saw when I looked clearly was far worse than I had originally suspected. I should describe Beverly more carefully, because she is not a background character in this story. She is, in many ways, the architect of what my marriage became, and she will be held accountable for the specific role she played, in the most specific terms, before this is over. Beverly Hartwell was the kind of woman who expressed opinions through implication. She never said, "Claire, I don't think you should be talking to your mother so much." She said things like, "Marcus tells me you're very close with your family in Savannah," and made the word close sound like a diagnosis. She never said, "I think Marcus should have more control in this marriage." She said, "My son is the head of his household, which is how a man should be," and smiled pleasantly while she said it. Like, this was simply weather being reported, and not a position statement on my autonomy. She was incredibly good at this. She had been practicing it for 61 years. What I did not know during the first 2.5 years of my marriage was how much time she and Marcus spent on the phone. I did not know that they talked, on average, 4 to 5 times a week, sometimes more. I did not know that Marcus told his mother things about our marriage in detail, specific arguments, specific decisions I had made, specific complaints he had, and that Beverly's responses functioned, for Marcus, as a kind of moral adjudication. She told him what was right and what was wrong. She told him what kind of wife I was being. And Marcus, who had grown up with only his mother's voice as the authority in the house, treated her verdicts as settled law. I found this out on a Wednesday evening in November, about 6 weeks after the phone incident. I had come home from work early because I had a headache, and I was walking through the hallway to the bedroom when I heard Marcus on the phone in the office, his voice lower than usual. I wasn't creeping. I wasn't spying. I was walking to my own bedroom in my own house. But I slowed down when I heard my name. He was saying, "She's been different lately, Ma, like she's pulling back or something. I can feel it." Beverly's voice was muffled through the door but present, that very particular tone she had, resonant and certain. Marcus said, "Yeah, I checked, and she hadn't called her sister in over a week, so I don't know." He paused. Then he said, "No, not yet. I don't want to look like I'm checking up on her." Another pause. Then, "Yeah, I know. I walked the rest of the way to the bedroom on completely silent feet and sat on the edge of the bed with my pulse in my temples. He had been checking whether I had called Denise. Of course I had, from the prepaid phone he didn't know about. But that wasn't the point. The point was that he had been monitoring whether I talked to my own sister and reporting the results to his mother, and they were apparently together deciding what to do about it. The headache, which had started behind my left eye, spread to the base of my skull. I did not walk into the office. I lay down with the lights off, and I thought about what I had just heard, with the same cold, methodical quality I had been developing over the past several weeks. He was tracking my calls to my family. Beverly was involved in the tracking. They communicated about me regularly and in detail. This was not a husband who was a little bit controlling and whose mother was a little bit overbearing. This was an organized effort to manage my access to my own family and my own life, and it had the full participation of Beverly Hartwell, who sat across from me at dinner and asked about my job and handed me a dish to pass and acted the entire time like she was simply a mother who loved her son. I want to say something here about rage, because I felt it that night, and I want you to understand what kind. It wasn't the kind that makes you cry or break things. It was the kind that arrives when you finally put all the pieces together and see the shape they make. It is clean and cold, and it does not wobble. I lay in the dark bedroom of the house I had put $40,000 into, listening to my husband finish his phone call with his mother, and I felt that clean, cold rage settle into me like weather settling into a valley. And then I picked up my prepaid phone and I texted Maya in Nashville. I need to tell you some things. I wrote. And then, I think I've been pretty stupid for a pretty long time. She wrote back in under a minute. You are the least stupid person I know. Tell me everything. I typed for 20 minutes. My thumbs were completely steady. Maya called me the next morning before my alarm went off at 6:45 while Marcus was in the shower. She was already dressed for work. I could hear Nashville traffic through her car window. She said, "Okay, I'm going to say something and I need you to hear it without it turning into a thing about whether Marcus is a good person." I said, "Okay." She said, "This is not about whether he's good or bad. This is about the fact that he sold your phone, he's monitoring your calls to your own family, and he's reporting to his mother like she's his CO. That's not a marriage. That's a supervision arrangement. And you are not a case file." I laughed, a short, startled, completely genuine laugh. "Yeah," I said. "That's what it is." She said, "What are you going to do?" I said, "I'm still figuring out the shape of it, but I know it doesn't look like this." She said, "Okay, let me know when you need me." And then, because Maya has always been exactly this kind of person, she said, "Do you have your own money somewhere he doesn't touch?" I told her I had a personal checking account I'd kept from before the marriage with about $4,800 in it. Not much, but separate. She said, "That's good. Keep it that way." The next several weeks were a masterclass in paying attention. I paid attention to everything. I paid attention to our joint accounts. I set up online access on my work computer and started checking weekly, then twice a week, noting every transaction. I paid attention to Marcus's patterns. When he called Beverly, how long they talked, the days when he came home with a particular set to his jaw that told me he had received an opinion he was planning to implement. I paid attention to the house. What was in his name, what was in both names, what was only in mine. What I found when I paid attention to the finances with genuine rigor began to clarify things very quickly. Our joint savings account had held, as I mentioned, just over $9,000 in late September. By mid-November, it held $4,200. $4,800 had been withdrawn in 3 separate transactions, one in October, 2 in early November, from an ATM in Marietta, near Beverly's house. I had made none of those withdrawals. Marcus had not mentioned them. When I went back through the past year of transactions, something I had never done in detail before, because I trusted the marriage the way you trust something you built yourself, I found a pattern of withdrawals I hadn't noticed, totaling over $16,000 in the past 14 months, all from ATMs in or near Marietta. Not all enormous individual amounts, 200 here, 300 there, sometimes 500, occasionally 1,000. The kind of amounts that don't trigger alarm individually. The kind that add up to $16,000 when you do the actual arithmetic. I printed those statements at the office. I put them in the same folder as my prepaid phone. I started a note on my work laptop labeled Q4 Project Notes that was not about Q4 or projects, but was a running, dated log of every incident I considered relevant. The phone sold, the conversation I heard in the hallway, each ATM withdrawal I found, every time Marcus made a comment about my family, every time Beverly said something in my presence that landed like a directive. I time-stamped everything. I cited amounts. I wrote it like evidence because I was already thinking of it as evidence, even before I had decided explicitly what I was building the evidence for. Here's the thing nobody tells you about leaving a controlling marriage. The hardest part is not the moment of decision. The hardest part is the period before it, when you are certain enough to act but not yet ready, and you have to carry that certainty quietly through every ordinary day. You have to sit across from your husband at breakfast and say normal things. You have to be pleasant at Beverly's house for Sunday dinner and eat her green beans and say thank you for the food while knowing what you know. You have to perform the marriage while simultaneously dismantling it from the inside, which is an extraordinary amount of cognitive labor that nobody gives you credit for. I did it for 6 more weeks. I was very good at it. In early December, a Thursday evening, Beverly came for dinner. She came for dinner at our house periodically, and Marcus cooked when she came. He liked to cook for his mother specifically, which was a dynamic I had stopped finding touching. She arrived at 6:30 with a container of her macaroni and cheese and the particular energy she always brought, which was the energy of a person who is technically a guest, but considers themselves the real authority of the space. We ate. It was fine. The food was good. Marcus was animated and lighter in a way he rarely was during our ordinary evenings, and watching him with his mother, I could see who he thought he was. Charming, competent, the head of his household, a man his mother could be proud of. It was the most honest version of him in some ways, and it was the saddest. After dinner, I was clearing plates, and Beverly was at the table with her coffee, and Marcus had stepped outside to take a work call. And Beverly looked up at me with that particular pleasant directness she had and said, "You know, Claire, a married woman doesn't need to tell her mother everything about her life." She said it like she was sharing a piece of wisdom she hoped I would find useful. Her voice was kind and calm, and it held approximately no awareness that she was speaking directly to my privacy, my autonomy, and my relationship with my own mother in the same breath. I stopped moving. I was holding 2 dinner plates, and I stood in the middle of my kitchen, and I looked at my mother-in-law, and I thought about the $16,000. I thought about the sold phone. I thought about the conversation through the office door. I thought about 3 years of small corrections delivered in pleasant voices that were designed to make me into a woman who existed only inside the borders of this house and this marriage and this family. Beverly's definition of family, not mine. I set the plates down on the counter very carefully. I said, "Beverly, with respect, my relationship with my mother is not something I'm interested in adjusting." I said it with complete evenness, not a shake in my voice, looking right at her. She held her coffee cup and looked back at me, and there was a small recalibration behind her eyes. She was deciding how to respond. She said, "I just think it's important that your first loyalty is here." I said, "My first loyalty is to my marriage, and calling my mother doesn't threaten that." And then Marcus came back in from the porch. He knew immediately something had happened. He looked at his mother's face, and then at mine, and I turned back to clearing the table and said nothing about it. Beverly said nothing about it either. We had dessert. She left at 8:30. Marcus and I said little to each other for the rest of the evening, and I went to bed before he did. I texted Maya from the prepaid phone at 9:15. "I think I'm close." She replied, "What do you need?" I lay in the dark, and I thought about what I needed, and then I texted back, "A lawyer." I want to pause here and say something to anyone watching who knows this particular feeling, the feeling of being absolutely certain that something is wrong, but also being absolutely certain that the people causing the wrong will never acknowledge it. That no matter how clearly you state what is happening, the people who are doing it will look at you with calm eyes and tell you that you're being oversensitive, or that it isn't what you think, or that your mother has too much influence on you, or that they're doing this out of love. I know that feeling. I lived in it for 3 years, and the last 6 weeks of living in it were the most clarifying of my life, because I stopped looking at those calm eyes and waiting for acknowledgement that was never coming. I started looking instead at documents. Documents don't reassure you. Documents just tell you what happened. My divorce attorney's name was Rochelle Greer. She had an office on Piedmont Road in Buckhead, Atlanta, and she was 43 years old with natural silver locks and a very quiet, methodical energy that reminded me immediately of my mother's sister, who was a retired judge. Her assistant had squeezed me in for a 45-minute consultation on a Wednesday during my lunch break, and I arrived with my folder, the bank statements, the Q4 project notes document printed out, the photos I had taken of the phone receipt Marcus had left on the counter from the sale, the photo of my original phone's purchase receipt that I had looked up in my email. I had the joint account history going back 14 months. I had written dates and amounts on a separate typed sheet. Rochelle looked at me over the folder and she said, "How long did it take you to put this together?" I said, "About 6 weeks, most of it on my lunch breaks." She nodded, very slowly. She said, "You understand that most people come to me with nothing." I said, "I understand." She said, "Okay, let's talk about what you have." We talked for the full 45 minutes. At the end, she said 2 things that I wrote down in the notes on my phone on the walk back to the parking garage. The first was, the withdrawals may constitute marital waste, and depending on how they were used, specifically if they were used to support his mother or any non-marital obligation, you have a legitimate claim for recoupment in the settlement. The second was, I want you to be very careful between now and when we file. Don't remove money, don't make any dramatic moves, don't confront him. Document everything. Let him operate under the assumption that nothing has changed. I said, "I can do that. And she said, "I believe you." She handed me her card and told me to email her the documents I had brought. I was back at my desk by 1:15 with my lunch still in my bag, uneaten. I ate it at my desk at 2 o'clock, and it tasted, for the first time in a while, like something. The week before Christmas is when things moved into a different gear. My company had our holiday party on the Thursday, and Marcus came as my plus one, which he always did, and he was exactly as charming with my coworkers as he always was. Easy laugh, good handshake, the kind of man who makes a room think she's lucky. My colleague Janelle, who sat 3 desks from mine and had once said to me that I always seemed a little tense when Marcus came up in conversation, caught my eye across the room at one point during the party. I gave her a small nod. She gave me one back. We had never talked explicitly about any of it, but Janelle had been paying attention in her quiet way, and sometimes being seen is enough. I had told my mother, by this point, the essential shape of what was happening. I had called her from the prepaid phone the Sunday before, and I had told her about the withdrawals, about Beverly's comment at dinner, about the call I'd overheard through the office door, about the phone that had been sold. I told her I was working with an attorney. There was a long silence on the other end, and then my mother said, "How long have you been planning this, baby?" I said, "About 2 months." She made a sound. Then she said, "I want you to come home." I said, "Mama, I'm not ready yet." She said, "The moment you are ready, Denise and I will be there." I said, "I know." She said, "Your room is exactly the same." I said, "Mama," she said, "I mean it." Sheets washed and everything. I laughed, and it felt like the warmest thing I'd felt in months. The week before Christmas, Rochelle called me and we discussed timing. She said I was in a strong position to file in January. She said the documentation was solid. She said the marital waste issue with the ATM withdrawals was something she intended to pursue aggressively in the settlement. $16,000 taken from a joint marital account over 14 months, withdrawn in the vicinity of the mother-in-law's residence, with no documentation of what it was used for. She said, "He'll have to account for every dollar of that." I said, "Good." She said, "Are you still in the house?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Do you have a safe exit plan?" I said, "I do." I had already arranged it with my mother and Denise. I would pack what was mine. My personal documents, my work equipment, specific items I had brought into the marriage or purchased independently. Photographs, the few pieces of jewelry that had been my grandmother's. In the week between Christmas and New Year's, while Marcus was going to be spending 2 days in Marietta with Beverly, I would load my car, I would drive to Savannah. Denise would be at my mother's house waiting. I want to tell you about the moment Beverly said what she said, the comment I mentioned at the opening of this story. And I want to tell you why it turned out to be almost a gift, because she said it again, not just at the dinner in early December. She came back for Christmas Eve dinner, which we hosted at our house, and this time there were 2 cousins of Marcus's there as well. His cousin Terrell and Terrell's wife Sandra, both from Mableton. And Beverly, in the middle of what was ostensibly a pleasant holiday dinner, made a comment about how she was glad that Marcus had a household where things were properly ordered. And then she said it to me, looking right at me while reaching for the sweet potato casserole. A married woman doesn't need to tell her mother everything about her life. Just like that. Again, in front of company. Terrell looked at his plate. Sandra looked at me. Marcus looked at the tablecloth. I looked at Beverly, and I said, very pleasantly, "I'm sure you found that to be true in your own experience." And then I passed the casserole. But what Beverly did not know, what Marcus did not know, was that Sandra, who had met me once before at a Hartwell family gathering, had caught my eye when Beverly said it. And something had passed between us in that look that was wordless and completely clear. After dinner, while the men were watching the game and Beverly was telling a story to no one in particular, Sandra followed me into the kitchen and said very quietly, "Is everything okay with you?" I said, "It's getting there." She said, "Beverly has been pulling this kind of thing since before I married Terrell. You don't have to explain anything to me." I said, "I know." She put a hand briefly on my arm and said, "You have my number from the group chat. Use it." I said, "Thank you." I put Sandra's number in the prepaid phone. In the 4 days between Christmas and New Year's, Marcus went to Beverly's house in Marietta to help her with some project. Repainting her guest room, he said. He would be gone for 2 nights, returning the afternoon of the 31st. He left on the 28th at 10 in the morning. By 10:15, I was standing in our bedroom with 2 large suitcases open on the bed, and I was very calmly and methodically packing what was mine. I took my personal documents, birth certificate, social security card, passport, the deed to a small piece of property in Chatham County that I had inherited from my grandfather, and that was, critically, in my name only. I took my work laptop and my work bag. I took the prepaid phone. I took my grandmother's jewelry, a gold bracelet, a pearl ring, a pair of earrings from her mother, from the box in the back of the top shelf where I had stored them, because Beverly had once commented that she was surprised I kept them in the house rather than in a safety deposit box, and I'd moved them there purely to get them out of Beverly's line of commentary. I took my professional clothes and a selection of my personal wardrobe. I took a framed photo of my mother, my grandmother, Denise, and me at Denise's nursing school graduation. I took the folder, the bank statements, the printed evidence document, the photos. I left my wedding ring on the kitchen counter. Not dramatically. I wasn't staging a scene for no one. I left it there because it was the correct place to leave something that had stopped meaning what it was supposed to mean. I made 3 trips to my car. It was cold and clear. That particular winter clarity that makes everything look sharp and slightly unreal. The neighbor's dog watched me from the other side of the fence. By 1 in the afternoon, I was on I-16 South headed towards Savannah, and the heater in my car was running, and there was a Mavis Staples song on the radio. And I called my mother from the prepaid phone using the hands-free mount I had bought for this drive specifically. She answered on the first ring. "I'm on my way, Mama," I said. I heard her exhale. I heard it completely. The full length of it, like she had been holding that breath for a very long time. Then she said, "Denise, get the sheets." And I heard Denise's voice somewhere in the background saying, "Mama, I already got the sheets. I told you I had the sheets." I laughed so hard I almost missed my exit. I was home by 4:30. My mother came out the front door of her Savannah house before I had turned the engine off, in her cardigan and her reading glasses still on, and she opened my car door the way she used to open the car door for me when I was small, and she said, "Come inside, baby, it's cold." I said, "Mama, I'm 27, she said, "and you're still my baby. Come inside." I went inside. Denise was in the kitchen making soup. Actual soup from scratch, the kind our grandmother used to make with okra and whatever else was available. My mother's house smelled like it had always smelled, something clean and slightly floral, and underneath that, the wood of old furniture and the faint sweetness of the candles she burned in the evenings. I sat down at the kitchen table I had done homework at, eaten 1,000 meals at, processed 1,000 things at, and Denise put a cup of hot tea in front of me and said, "You look good." I said, "I look tired." She said, "Yeah, but underneath that, you look like yourself." I called Rochelle the morning of the 29th. I told her I had left the house. She said, "Good." She said, "Don't go back without me." She said the papers would be filed the week of January 5th after the holiday. She said, "Are you in a safe place?" I said, "I'm at my mother's house in Savannah." She said, "Perfect. Don't contact him until we've filed." I said, "What do I do if he contacts me?" She said, "You let it go to voicemail." Marcus called me that evening. I did not answer. He called 3 more times. I did not answer. He left a voicemail. "Claire, call me back. I need to know you're okay." I filed it mentally under things that would have been more convincing if delivered 3 years ago. The 31st was New Year's Eve. I sat with my mother and Denise and my mother's neighbor, Mrs. Freeman, who was 74 and brought a bottle of Moscato and was delightful. And we watched the Times Square countdown and ate black-eyed peas for good luck. And I went to bed at 12:30, feeling something I hadn't felt inside a building in so long, I had almost forgotten it was available to me. Safety. Simple, uncomplicated safety. The sheets my mother had washed smelled like the detergent she had used my entire life, and the ceiling of my childhood bedroom was exactly as I remembered it, and I slept 9 hours without waking once. On January 1st, at 6:17 in the morning, my phone showed 3 missed calls from Marcus from the previous night, and one from an unknown Georgia number that I suspected was Beverly. And then, at 11:40 that morning, my mother knocked on my bedroom door and said, "Baby, Marcus is here." I want to describe that moment carefully. I had been sitting on my bed reading a book I had borrowed from Denise. A novel. Something light. The kind of thing I hadn't had the brain space to read in over a year. When my mother knocked, I looked up from the page, and she pushed the door open just slightly and said, in a voice that was absolutely measured, "Marcus is at the front door. He drove from Atlanta this morning." I set the book down. I thought, so he did. I had half expected this, and I was not afraid of it. I was something else entirely. Still, the way deep water is still. I got up, put on my slippers, and went down the hallway. My mother had left him on the porch. She had not invited him in. I want to be precise about this. My mother, Patricia Whitfield, the woman who had fed this man multiple Sunday dinners and taught him how she liked the chicken seasoned and welcomed him into her house 3 years ago, had left him standing on the porch in the January cold. That is the kind of woman she is. She knew the shape of things. I opened the front door and looked at my husband through the screen door. He was wearing his good coat, the navy one, and he had clearly driven 4 hours without stopping based on the set of his jaw and the state of his hair. He looked at me, and he looked, for the first time in recent memory, genuinely uncertain. Not sad in a way that was supposed to move me, uncertain, like the ground had shifted under him and he was just now noticing. "Marcus," I said. "Claire," he said, "you left." His voice had the same quality as the day he told me he'd sold my phone, trying to make a statement of fact do the work of an argument. "You left?" Like that itself was the transgression. I said, "Yes." He said, "You didn't tell me you were leaving." He was using the voice he used when he had decided I had been unreasonable. The patient, slightly aggrieved voice of a man who believed he was the injured party. I said, "You didn't tell me you were going to sell my phone either." His jaw moved. He said, "Is this about the phone?" I said, "It's not only about the phone." He said, "Then what is it about?" I said, "Marcus, my attorney is going to be in touch." He stared at me. His face went through several things in quick succession. I watched it happen. He said, "Your attorney?" I said, "Yes." He said, "You have an attorney?" I said, "Yes." He said, "For what?" I said, "For the divorce." The word sat between us on that porch, like a piece of furniture that had always been in the room, and we were both pretending not to see. I saw the moment it landed for him. The moment he understood this wasn't a fight that could be managed with his usual tools. This wasn't me being upset about something he could redirect or dismiss or wait out. This was a process that had already begun. Papers that were already being prepared. Decisions already made? He said, "Claire?" His voice changed. The aggrieved tone fell out of it, and underneath was something rawer. "Claire, come on. Let's go home and talk about this." I said, "There's nothing to talk about on the porch that's going to change anything. My attorney's name is Rochelle Greer. Her office is in Buckhead. You'll hear from her in the first week of January." He said, "You can't just..." He stopped. He tried again. He said, "Claire, I love you. Just come home." I looked at him. I thought about the phone. I thought about $16,000 in ATM withdrawals I had never authorized and had never been told about. I thought about standing in the hallway listening to him tell his mother he was tracking whether I called my sister. I thought about Beverly Hartwell sitting at my dinner table on Christmas Eve and telling me, in front of his cousin's wife, in front of company, that a married woman doesn't need to tell her mother everything about her life while sitting 20 feet from my mother's own front door. I said, "Marcus, you sold my phone so I couldn't talk to my family. And your mother told me, at my own dinner table, that I shouldn't need to. I need you to think very carefully about whether this is really a marriage that was built on love, or whether it's something else. Because I've done my thinking. I've done a lot of it." And that's where I landed. He opened his mouth. He closed it. I said, "Safe drive back." And I went back inside and closed the door. Not hard, not with any drama, just completely. My mother was in the hallway. She had not been eavesdropping. She had simply been nearby, the way mothers are. She looked at me and said, "You okay?" I said, "Yeah, Mama, I'm really okay." She nodded once. Then she said, "Come eat something." Denise made more of that soup. We sat at the kitchen table, the three of us, and I ate soup. Outside, I heard Marcus's car engine start eventually, and then the sound of him pulling away from the curb. My mother poured more tea. Denise told a story about something that had happened at the hospital the week before that made absolutely no sense until the punchline, and then was the funniest thing I had heard in 6 months. I laughed until my eyes watered. The papers were filed on January 8th. Rochelle called me at 2 in the afternoon and said, "It's done." I said, "Okay." She said, "He'll be served in the next few days." I said, "All right." She said, "How are you doing?" I said, "I'm genuinely fine." She said, "I believe you." What happened when Marcus was served was, I'm told, through the chain of communication that runs through attorneys when two parties are no longer speaking directly, not pleasant. His attorney, a man in Sandy Springs named Cliff Donovan, called Rochelle with the kind of opening move that is essentially a test of what you have. They claimed the marriage had broken down due to irreconcilable differences, implied I had abandoned the marital home, and suggested that my departure indicated instability. Rochelle responded by sending, in the initial discovery materials, the full 14 months of joint account statements with the ATM withdrawals highlighted and a formal request that Marcus account for the destination of $16,240 in cash withdrawals from joint marital funds. The response to that was a much quieter phone call. The forensic accountant Rochelle brought in was named Gary Peterson, and he was the kind of person who looked at a spreadsheet the way a surgeon looks at a chest x-ray. Methodically, without drama, seeing things other people miss. He worked on our financial records for 3 weeks and produced a report that was, in Rochelle's words, exactly as useful as she hoped. What Gary found was that the $16,240 in ATM withdrawals had been taken over 14 months in amounts that consistently corresponded, not exactly, but closely, to expenses that appeared afterward in Beverly Hartwell's personal bank records, which were not directly subpoenaed, but which Marcus's own attorney's clumsy interrogatory responses made clear were the destination. Gary documented this through correlation of amounts, dates, and geographic proximity of the ATMs to Beverly's address. He also found something I had not expected. Marcus had opened a personal credit card in his name only 18 months into our marriage and had been carrying a balance of approximately $22,000, charged over the subsequent 18 months, with expenses including restaurant charges, hotel stays, 2 of which were at the same Marietta Hotel over weekends, and recurring charges to what appeared to be dating or social applications. I read Gary's report on a Tuesday afternoon sitting at my mother's kitchen table, and I was very quiet for a long time afterward. The hotel charges are the ones I want to address directly because they deserve a direct address. 2 hotel stays in Marietta, booked on Friday evenings and checking out on Saturday mornings. The dates were in the report. I went back through my memories of those weekends, and in both cases, Marcus had told me he was going to Beverly's to help her with something. Once a plumbing issue, once a car that needed a jump start that turned into a prolonged mechanical thing that kept him overnight. I had believed him. I had stayed home and made dinner for myself and called my mother from the back porch with my window open. The name on the hotel room the second time, the one Gary found through the credit card statement, was not Marcus Hartwell alone. There was a second charge pattern on the card that corresponded to a woman's name. A Destiny Pryor, whose name appeared in the associated expenses of several charges in the same geographic cluster and time period. Destiny Pryor, 25 years old, I would later learn through the quiet due diligence of one of Rochelle's investigators. A woman who had worked briefly in an administrative role at the same professional association that Marcus was involved in. A woman who did not know, as far as I could determine, that Marcus had a wife who was simultaneously putting $40,000 into the down payment on a house in Duluth and decorating that house and making dinner in it and going to family gatherings in it and organizing Christmas Eve dinners in it. Or perhaps she had known and decided it was not her problem. That distinction matters in terms of the kind of person she is, but it does not change the accounting. I called Rochelle after I finished reading the report. I said, "How does this change the filing?" She said, "Significantly and favorably." She said, "The credit card debt of $22,000 accumulated during the marriage on a personal card for personal non-marital expenditures is marital debt that we will argue he bears solely." She said, "The hotel and associated charges are relevant to the marital waste claim and to the adultery grounds." She said, "In Georgia, adultery is grounds for fault divorce, and it affects the court's view of equitable distribution." She said, "How are you feeling?" I said, "Honestly, surprisingly clear-headed." She said, "Good, stay that way. This is the part where clarity is an asset." I said, "What about Beverly? Specifically, her involvement?" Rochelle was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Beverly is not a party to the divorce. But the financial transfers, if we can establish that marital funds were systematically transferred to her, we pursue that through the marital waste and dissipation claim. He'll have to account for where those withdrawals went. If they went to Beverly, she becomes relevant." I said, "Okay." She said, "Do you have anything that links her more directly? Do you have any communications?" I thought about the conversation I had heard through the office door, the timestamps in my evidence document. I told Rochelle about it, about what I had heard, about his words. I checked, and she hadn't called her sister in over a week. She was silent for a moment. Then she said, "That is a significant statement. The husband was monitoring the plaintiff's communications with her family of origin, reporting to his mother, and coordinating with the mother on how to manage the plaintiff's behavior in the marriage." She said it in her attorney voice, flat, precise, built for documentation. Then she said, "In my personal voice and not my attorney voice." "That's disturbing." I said, "I know." She said, "Okay. I want you to write out everything you heard that day, dated and time-stamped, as a contemporaneous account." I said, "I already have it." She said, "Of course you do. Beverly Hartwell received her own letter in February, not from Rochelle directly, but from Gary Peterson's office, as part of the financial discovery process, requesting documentation of any funds received from Marcus Hartwell over the preceding 24 months. The letter was not aggressive in tone. It did not have to be. It simply asked her to account. I was told by Rochelle, secondhand, that Beverly's response to this letter was to call Marcus in considerable distress, and that this phone call was the origin of a significant rupture in Marcus's presentation of himself to his own attorney. Because he had not, it appeared, told his attorney about the transfers to his mother, and this discovery created a problem for his entire initial legal posture. This is what I mean when I say that Beverly's involvement, which she had conducted with such confident pleasantness across so many Sunday dinners, turned out to carry its own accounting. She had told me a married woman doesn't need to tell her mother everything about her life, while her son was routing money from our joint marital account to her and Marietta. She had sat at my table and implied that my relationship with my mother was the problem in my marriage, while she was apparently the daily confidant, strategic advisor, and financial beneficiary of my husband's management of our household. She had looked at me with kind eyes and said things that were designed to diminish my family ties and strengthen her own hold on her son's life and finances, and she had done it consistently, patiently, and with full knowledge of what she was doing. The letter from Gary Peterson's office required her to either account for the money or deny receiving it. Either answer created problems. I did not pity her, not even slightly. The mediation was held in March at a conference room at Rochelle's building on Piedmont Road on a Thursday morning at 9 o'clock. I wore a dark green wrap dress and flat shoes, and I arrived 7 minutes early and had coffee and felt sitting in that conference room with Rochelle across from me almost entirely calm. Marcus arrived with Cliff Donovan. He looked different. Not devastated exactly, but reduced. Like something that had been taking up a lot of space had gone out of him. He was wearing a gray suit I recognized. He glanced at me when he came in and then looked away quickly. I looked at him for a moment and felt the same thing I had felt on my mother's porch in January. Clarity. Not anger by then, not grief, just clarity, which is what grief and anger become when they've done their full work and burned clean. Rochelle laid out our position in the organized, relentless way I had trusted she would. The marital home in Duluth, purchased with $40,000 of my premarital savings as part of the down payment, in addition to joint funds. And her argument for my substantial equity share, given both my documented financial contribution and the marital waste that had depleted joint funds. The $16,240 in ATM withdrawals, with Gary's full documentation of the correlation to Beverly's household expenses. The $22,000 in personal credit card debt incurred by Marcus during the marriage for non-marital purposes, including the hotel charges. The fault grounds, adultery, with the documentary trail from the credit card and Gary's corroborating findings. Cliff Donovan made the kinds of counters that attorneys make when their client has not given them much to work with. The withdrawals were for household expenses that Marcus could account for. The credit card charges were miscategorized. The fault grounds were exaggerated. Rochelle listened to each one with an expression that I can only describe as polite patience. The expression of someone who has already anticipated everything being said and has prepared accordingly. She pulled out the supporting documentation for each point, one at a time, in a particular order. The stack of papers diminished from her side of the table and moved to the center as we went. By 11:30, Cliff Donovan asked for a 20-minute break. During the break, Rochelle stepped out with him for what I can only assume was a frank professional conversation. I sat in the conference room with my coffee and looked out the window at Piedmont Road, at the January trees and the February bare branches. It was March by then, but not fully green, that late winter in between. And I thought about absolutely nothing in particular, which was itself a kind of peace. When they came back, the settlement conversation that followed was not comfortable for Marcus's side, but it was thorough and it was definitive. The marital home would be sold, and I would receive 58% of the net proceeds, reflecting both my documented down payment contribution and the marital waste finding. The $16,240 would be recouped from Marcus's share of those proceeds. The $22,000 in credit card debt was assigned solely to Marcus. I retained my personal checking account, the $4,800 I had carefully kept separate throughout. My professional retirement account, which I had continued contributing to throughout the marriage, remained entirely mine. Marcus sat through the final summary with his hands flat on the table and his jaw set and said very little. At one point, Cliff Donovan put a hand briefly on Marcus's arm in the way that attorneys do when their client is approaching a visible emotional moment in a professional setting. Marcus looked at the table. I signed where Rochelle showed me to sign. The pen was a smooth ballpoint, and my signature looked exactly the same as it always did. When we stood to leave, Marcus looked at me across the table and said, "Claire." Just my name, with a particular quality I didn't know how to categorize. Like there was a full sentence behind it that he had decided not to say. I held his look for a moment, the way you hold a moment that you know is the last of its kind. And then I picked up my bag and walked out, with Rochelle. In the elevator, Rochelle said, "You did well." I said, "We did." She said, "You did the documentation." I said, "You did the settlement." She said, "Fair." She pressed the lobby button. She said, "How are you feeling?" I said, "I feel like I could eat a very large meal." She laughed, a real sudden laugh, and said, "I'll take that as a good sign." The house sold in early May. The housing market in Duluth was active, and the house, which I had, after all, decorated with real care and real taste, showed beautifully. It sold for $46,000 more than we had paid, and my 58% of the net proceeds arrived in my bank account on a Tuesday afternoon in mid-May, while I was sitting in my office in Midtown Atlanta. I had not gone back to Savannah permanently. I loved my mother's house, but I had my life in Atlanta, my job, my colleagues, my particular routine. But I had found an apartment in Virginia Highland, a bright second-floor one-bedroom with 1,200 square feet and big windows that faced east, and I had signed the lease in April and moved in with Denise's help and Maya's moral support, and 2 new pieces of furniture I bought specifically because Marcus would have considered them impractical. One was a reading chair the color of good wine, in a corner near the east window, with a lamp beside it. The other was a large kitchen table with 6 chairs, because I intended to have people for dinner. I want to tell you what happened to Marcus and Beverly because this story doesn't belong in the category of things that end with vague references to karma. I am not a person who trusts karma. I trust documentation and consequence. Marcus, with the settlement terms applied and the credit card debt assigned to him and his share of the home, proceeds reduced by the recouped withdrawals, walked away from the marriage in significantly worse financial shape than he had entered it, which is what happens when you spend 34 months quietly redistributing marital assets to your mother and running an affair on a personal credit card, and you meet a woman who is careful and thorough and patient enough to document all of it. He was still at the same company. His employment was not something I had any interest in targeting, and I'm not the kind of person who calls a man's boss. But the social architecture of his life had shifted considerably. Several of the mutual friends from our time as a couple, people who had been at our wedding and our cookouts and our holiday parties, had received a clear enough account of what had happened from enough credible sources that the story Marcus might have preferred to tell, the one where Claire just left, out of nowhere, in a way that made her seem unstable, did not take hold the way he probably hoped. Sandra, Terrell's wife, had a lot to do with that. She was thorough in a way that I deeply appreciated. By the summer after the divorce was finalized, Marcus was living in an apartment in Marietta, near his mother, which is where he had always wanted to be, I suppose, and Destiny Pryor, who had apparently been under the impression that once the wife was out of the picture, things would move towards something more permanent, had, according to the information that reaches me through mutual adjacent channels, discovered that Marcus in full-time availability is a significantly less appealing prospect than Marcus in the romantic drama of A Secret. They were, by late summer, no longer in contact. I felt no satisfaction about this beyond the mild satisfaction of seeing accurate prediction confirmed. Beverly Hartwell had her own accounting to face, and I want to be specific about it. The financial discovery process, Gary Peterson's report, the letter to Beverly's address, the documented correlation between Marcus's withdrawals and her household expenses, became part of the public record of the divorce proceedings. Not a criminal record, not a fraud charge, I'm being precise about this, but a civil record in a Georgia county court, establishing that $16,240 of marital funds had been diverted to her. That record exists. Records like that have a way of being findable by people who go looking. Terrell and Sandra, I am told, went looking. Terrell's relationship with his Aunt Beverly had never been uncomplicated. Beverly was not an easy woman, and the specificity of what that record showed shifted something in that family that I don't believe has fully realigned. Beyond the family, Beverly had spent years building her standing as a church elder and a community matriarch in Marietta. She was the kind of woman who received quiet public deference in her social environment, and that deference was connected, consciously or not, to her reputation as the devoted, sacrificing mother who had raised a fine son alone and was now the foundation of his good household. When the household collapsed, publicly and on specific grounds, marital waste, dissipation of assets, adultery, and her name appeared in the court documentation as the recipient of those diverted assets, the story could not be as easily managed as she would have liked. I am told by Sandra through a text she sent me in August that Beverly had said at a church function that the divorce was Claire's choice and the marriage had been perfectly fine. Sandra said she had listened to this and then said very quietly that she had read the court documents and that perfectly fine was an interesting characterization. She said Beverly had not spoken to her directly since. I felt something when Sandra told me that. Not triumph exactly. Recognition. Like watching a river find its own level. My life in Virginia Highlands settled into a rhythm that surprised me with its texture. I went to work. I came home. I cooked in my own kitchen without calculating whether anything I did would create friction. I called my mother on Sunday and during the week when I felt like it, and every single Sunday and whenever she called me first, and whenever I just wanted to hear her voice, which is frequently, which is as it should be. I called Denise. I called Maya, who came to visit in June and slept on the pull-out sofa and dragged me to a farmer's market at 7 in the morning on Saturday and made me buy flowers for the table, which turned out to be exactly right. I started going to a yoga studio around the corner from my apartment on Tuesday and Thursday evenings. I had not exercised with any consistency during the marriage. There were subtle ways that Marcus made it difficult, logistical frictions that I won't detail, but that added up to me simply not going. And rediscovering what it felt like to have a body I was actively taking care of was something I had not expected to be so quietly profound. I read the books I had been meaning to read. I stayed up late when I wanted to. I watched the things I wanted to watch. I made the reading chair the most important piece of furniture in the apartment, and I sat in it most evenings and felt the particular satisfaction of existing in a space that was entirely organized around my own preferences, not negotiated, not managed, not curated to avoid friction, just mine. My colleague Janelle, who had caught my eye at the holiday party and who knew more than she ever said out loud, brought me a plant when I moved into the new apartment. A pothos, because she said they were impossible to kill. And that was what I needed right now. The plant is on the windowsill near the reading chair. It is extremely healthy. In September, 8 months after I left, I had dinner with a group that included a man named Everett Crawford, a 31-year-old landscape architect who had been living in Atlanta for 3 years after moving from Houston, and who was the kind of person who asked questions because he actually wanted to know the answers. We talked for most of the evening, and he laughed at the right things and was not performing, and he called me 2 days later and asked if I wanted to get coffee sometime. I said yes. We got coffee. We have had coffee several times since then, and other things besides coffee, and it is early, and it is easy, and it is built on honesty in a way that I take seriously, precisely because I now understand exactly what the alternative feels like. But I want to be clear, Everett is not the point of this story. He's a good thing that happened because I had made the right decisions. He is what the open space of a well-made decision can eventually allow. The point of this story is not that I found someone else. The point is what I found when I stopped organizing my life around managing someone else's comfort. I am 28 years old now, which means I was 27 when I stood in that Kroger parking lot with my hand open and empty and my phone gone. 1 year. 1 year between that moment and this one. In that year, I built documentation, consulted a forensic accountant, worked with a divorce attorney, finalized a settlement, moved into an apartment in Virginia Highland, bought a wine-colored reading chair, and had my sister and my mother and my best friend in my space in the ways that I need them. On my schedule, at my own volume, without a single person in the world telling me that a married woman doesn't need that. My mother's voice, on the other end of the line whenever I call her, sounds exactly as it has always sounded. Warm, specific, present. I know that sound the way I know my own heartbeat. I was never going to give it up. The fact that someone tried to make me give it up, that he sold the physical device through which that voice reached me and called it a reasonable decision, tells you everything you need to know about the kind of marriage it was. He didn't just take my phone. He told me what he thought I was worth, and what he thought my people were worth, and what he thought love was supposed to cost me. He was wrong on every count. Beverly told me that a married woman doesn't need to tell her mother everything about her life. And I want to address that directly for the last time and then not spend another word on it. Beverly Hartwell spent years teaching her son that the proper architecture of a marriage is one where the wife is managed and monitored and her outside connections are controlled, and then she participated in that management as the primary outside authority in her son's decisions about his household. She received marital funds, and she knew where they came from. She covered for absences, and she knew what the absences were for. She sat at my table and ate my food and said pleasant things to my face, and then got on the phone with her son and helped him decide how to handle me. She is in her 60s, and she chose all of this with full awareness. I have no interest in explaining or defending myself to her. I have no interest in her understanding my perspective. I have simply moved in a direction where she is not. What I learned, and this is the part I want you to hold, if you hold anything from this story, is that trust is not an act of faith. It is an act of observation. I trusted Marcus early in our marriage because my observations were limited. I was not yet watching the right things. When I started watching, I found $16,000 in ATM withdrawals and hotel charges, and a mother-in-law operating as a household monitor and a prepaid phone I had to hide in the lining of my work bag in my own house. The observations told me the truth. The truth told me what to do. I did it. I also learned that the people who are trying to cut you off from your own family are not doing it for your benefit. They will tell you they are. They will say things like you're too dependent on your mother and your family has too much influence and a married woman doesn't need. And all of it, every bit of it, is about creating a version of you that is isolated and small enough to manage. My mother was not the problem in my marriage. My mother was the person who kept the sheets washed and ready and opened the car door and said, "Come inside, baby, it's cold." On the day I finally came home, I also learned that documentation is the most dignified form of self-protection there is. It is not revenge. It is not cruelty. It is the simple refusal to allow your own experience of a situation to be rewritten by someone who has more to gain from a different version of events. Every statement, every date, every amount, every overheard word I recorded in that Q4 project notes file was me insisting that what I knew was real, that I was not imagining it, that my perception was accurate, that the truth of my own life belonged to me. And Rochelle Greer and Gary Peterson took that truth and turned it into a settlement, and the settlement is final, and the record exists in Gwinnett County Court documents that are not going anywhere. I also learned, and I say this carefully because I know it will land differently for different people, that you are not required to forgive in order to heal. I have not forgiven Marcus for selling my phone and lying to my face and routing marital money to his mother and conducting a relationship with another woman on a credit card while I was decorating our shared house. I have not forgiven Beverly for the years of careful, pleasant undermining she conducted in my home and at her table. Not forgiving them has not made me bitter. It has made me precise. There is a difference between bitterness and clarity, and I live on the clarity side of that line, and I find it a very good place to live. On an October morning, exactly 1 year after the parking lot, I was sitting in my wine-colored reading chair with a cup of coffee and the east light coming through the window and the pothos on the sill being very alive. And I thought about that moment, my hand open and empty, the bags of groceries at my feet, the specific quality of the not yet understanding settling into understanding. And I thought about everything that had come from that moment. Not from the betrayal itself, but from the decision I made about the betrayal. From the choice made in that kitchen to pay attention, to go still, to build something that could not be taken from me. I thought about my mother saying, "Come inside, baby." I thought about Denise saying, "You look like yourself." I thought about Maya asking, "What do we do first?" I thought about Rochelle laying papers on a conference table with the particular economy of a woman who is very good at her work. I thought about my own signature, steady, on documents that meant I was done. And then I looked at the plant on the windowsill, which is green and continuing, and I drank my coffee in the morning light, and I felt, in the quietest and most complete way, free. If this story woke something in you, if at any point while you were listening you thought, "I know that feeling. I know what it is to doubt your own perception while someone smiles and tells you you're too sensitive. I know what it costs to perform a marriage while quietly deciding you deserve more than what it's offering," then leave your comment below. Tell me where you're watching from. Tell me what part of this landed for you. Because you are not alone in this, and you are not imagining it. And what you know about your own life is information, not paranoia. If you are in a situation where someone has been carefully cutting you off from the people who love you, whether it's a husband or a mother-in-law or both, or any combination of people who have decided that your isolation serves them, I want you to hear this clearly. Acting is possible. Documentation is power. A prepaid phone from a Target, a folder of printed bank statements, a divorce attorney in Buckhead. These are not dramatic gestures. They are the practical tools of a woman who decided her life was worth more than the comfort of not knowing. And you have access to those tools. You have always had access to them. Leave your like on this video. Subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell, because this is a place where we tell stories about women who decided that the truth was worth more than the performance of peace. Share this video if you know someone who has been making excuses for a person who stopped deserving them a very long time ago. Sometimes we need to see that it is possible. Possible to find out, possible to prepare, possible to walk away with what you're owed and build something that is entirely yours. A strong hug from me to you, wherever you are. And remember this, you do not owe anyone silence about what they did to you. You do not owe anyone the protection of a story that erases your experience. You do not owe anyone, not a husband, not a mother-in-law, not a community, not a church, not a neighborhood, the performance of a life that is shrinking you. The truth of what you know belongs to you, and what you do with it is entirely up to you. I chose documentation. I chose Rochelle Greer. I chose a wine-colored reading chair in Virginia Highland and a phone that rings whenever my mother calls. I chose correctly, and I would choose it again.